Today I have another classic anniversary review. I will take a look back at the classic album that changed the game for one of rock's most innovative trios. I'm talking about Rush and their 1984 album, Grace Under Pressure. Now, I'll admit, for years I slept in this one and the band's other 80s output, but after revisiting it recently, I was surprised by how they managed to change their sound while still sounding like Rush. We're going to take a look into the making of this album, from the writing and recording process to the inspiration behind some of the standout tracks. I'll break down the notable sound changes, like their increased use of synthesizers and new wave elements. I'll also mention a few other things that helped shape this album, such as a new producer and their sources of inspiration for writing the songs. So let's get into this. This is the 10th studio album by Rush. It was released on April 12, 1984 through Anthem Records. The album is celebrating 40 years, and this is an interesting album because they really started to change their sound towards more of a new wave type of sound. But they maintained their progressive rock style. They used a lot more keyboards than before. They didn't have the long prog rock songs. The sound was just different. But I've never heard any Rush fans complain about this album or say they don't like it, despite the more commercial sound. Let's talk more about this. This is the first album not produced by Terry Brown since the 70s. They wanted something different, so they went with Peter Henderson. The album was still pretty popular. It did well on the charts. It peaked at number 10 on the US Billboard 100. It was certified platinum for selling 1 million copies. Let's talk a little bit more about the recording process. They started the process after the tour for the previous album called Signals. They decided to get together and write some new material. They went to a lodge in Horseshoe Valley in Ontario. As usual, Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson worked on the music, and drummer Neil Peart wrote the lyrics. A lot of songs were inspired by news events, and they got them from a local newspaper from Toronto called the Globe and Mail. After about a few weeks, they had enough songs, they decided to record a demo. At this point in time, they didn't have a producer. They had auditioned a few, but they eventually decided on Peter Henderson. This worked for the band because he let the band make a lot of creative decisions. In the liner notes, they are listed as co-producers. When the group was ready to record, they went to Le Studio in Morgan Heights, Quebec. The recording process was pretty lengthy. This was actually the longest period they had ever spent recording an album. They spent up to 14 hours a day in the studio, but in the end, they say this was one of the best records. If you're wondering about the album title, it comes from a quote from Ernest Hemingway. Neil Peart was a big fan of Hemingway, and he liked the quote, which is, "Courage is grace under pressure." So that's where the album title came from. Here's some more interesting trivia. They made a music video for the song, The Enemy Within, and it was the first song played on Canada's answer to MTV, which is a show called Much Music. The musical style was different. They had been gradually changing their sound since 1981 with moving pictures, but then they released Signals after that, which had more keyboard synthesizers. But this one took it a little further. They incorporated some ska and reggae music. According to Alex Lifeson, the album was more guitar-centric than the previous album, Signals. Now let's talk about the album art. The cover is pretty cool. It was painted by Hugh Syme. He was the guy who created every Rush album cover since 1975. On the back, you can see a portrait of the band taken by a photographer named Youssef Karsh. So this photo is very 80s looking. They wanted to go black and white. It was a little different than they had before. The opening track is called Distant Early Warning. This is a song that deals with the fear of nuclear war. This was something that was on people's minds back in the 80s. The idea behind the song was that people had it in the back of their minds, but the idea of it didn't paralyze people to the point where they stopped living their lives and having normal relationships with others. So like most Rush songs, there was a deeper meaning. I noticed that the guitar had a clean and twangy tone. The bass line was very memorable, and they added in the keyboard sounds during the first verse. Alex Lifeson also played some guitar riffs reminiscent of 80s hard rock. I think the best part of the song is Geddy Lee's bass. I also think that the solo is a classic, and of course, the drumming is some of the best. Next is a song called After Image. This is a song about death. It was about Robbie Whalen. He was an engineer on a few of the recent Rush albums, and he died in a car accident during a snowstorm while leaving the studio. This song had an interesting sound. Geddy Lee's bass had a distorted sound, but it was contrasted by the bright sounding guitars and keyboards. This one also has some classic guitar riffs by Alex Lifeson. I like the atmospheric section in the middle of the song. It has a very space-like sound. The guitar solo was also very memorable. It was cool because it was a 1-minute instrumental section. Next is Red Sector A. This one is about astronauts and the space shuttle flight. It was the name of an actual area that the band was in when they were watching a space shuttle take off at the Kennedy Space Station in Florida. I like the hard-driving bass guitar sounds in the song. There's also something else I didn't mention yet. Geddy Lee uses a lower vocal range compared to his albums from the 70s, so I thought this works well with this particular style. It was the song was more keyboard heavy. The guitars were still present though. There were also some interesting drum patterns in the second half of the song. Overall, the song is a very science fiction type of feel. Next is The Enemy Within, which is part 1 of Fear. Now, this is kind of confusing unless you're a big Rush nerd and you understand the entire concept, but for me, I had to look it up. Basically, there are 3 songs in a series called Fear. This is part 1, but part 2 and 3 were already released. Part 2 is The Weapon from the Signals album, and part 3 is Witch Hunt from Moving Pictures. They were basically released in reverse order. Basically, the song's about fear like the other 2, but it's kind of an internal fear. So I guess that's how they can describe it, I guess. So this was one of the more upbeat songs, and like most of the other songs on the album, bass guitar really stands out. And let me also say, this might have some of Neil Peart's best drumming as well. He adds different layers of sound. It's kind of like a reggae song, but also very science fiction, spacey, that type of sound. It was pretty unique. So now we move on to side 2 of the album, and there are 4 more songs. The first song on side 2 is Body Electric, and this is based off an episode of The Twilight Zone called I Sing the Body Electric. And for those of you who have been watching my channel for a long time, you might know I am a big Twilight Zone fan. It's probably my favorite TV show of all time, and I'm talking about the original series from the 50s and 60s. But anyway, this is an episode about a robot grandmother, and the song is about this. It's a really good song. I think after all the album reviews I've been doing over the past 4 years, this is actually the first time I heard a song that had binary code in the song's chorus, so it's really a cool song. The guitar solo is great, and it's one of the more upbeat songs. The next song on side 2 is called Kid Gloves. This is basically about kids and learning and going through a school and how some people can't grow up and mature. This one was pretty good. It was a hard rocker. I think the highlight of the song was the guitar solo. It had many different layers. The next song is called Red Lenses. This one had a few interpretations. I read a few different interpretations of it online. One person said it's about paranoia, how it can distort judgment. Another person said it was about the Russians at the time and communism in general, and that was a big deal in the 80s. So I'm not really sure the exact meaning of this one. The song was a little different. I think the way to describe it would be 80s new wave mixed with progressive rock. They had that synth pop sound from that time period, but with time signatures and complex arrangements. So I guess that's how I could describe it. So we have another song, and the last song called Between the Wheels. This one's basically about living under pressure, not knowing when things can change. It's the basic idea. As the final song, it was pretty good. It had more of a darker and climactic type of feel. It still stayed in line with the overall tone of the album. So now for my final thoughts. I thought it was a very good album. I will be honest with you, like I mentioned in the beginning, I never really paid much attention to the 3 albums that came out in the 80s, which would be this one, Power Windows, and Hold Your Fire. I got back into this band when Presto came out. I think it was 1989. I'll probably review that at one point this year, but this album is a little different. It has a lot to offer. I think you should check it out. I think it really holds up despite the very like 80s type of sound, but I think it still holds up. So that's what I want to say. That is all. Check out the other review from this Rush album right here. I did a few of them. Here's one of them. Thanks for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up here. Helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe if you're not already. I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, and more. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.